this edition of Synth Masterclass with computer music, we're going to be using the highly capable Bazille CM plugin from Yuhi to create a really great bass sound. The first thing we need to do is open up the plugin and perform an initialize. And we do this by going to the display, which is at the very top of the plugin, clicking on it, and coming down to Init for initialize at the bottom. When you click on that, it will initialize the plugin. We'll also need to just pop to the delay section, which is on the bottom right-hand corner of the plugin, and switch it off. Once you've done that, you'll hear a sound like this, which is just a default sine wave. We're going to start creating our sound by going to the oscillator 1 section, which is just to the left of the oscilloscope in the center. Come halfway down the oscillator 1 strip, and you'll see PD for phase distortion next to a pot. Turn the phase distortion pot all the way up to a value of 100. And just as a reminder, anytime we make an alteration to a pot or a fader on screen, you'll see the value displayed in the upper display. We should now have a nice bright sawtooth that sounds like this. We're going to thicken the texture of that sawtooth even further by coming down to the fractalize section, which is at the bottom of oscillator 1. Go to the drop-down menu that currently reads off and select sawtooth. Then, the pot right next door, click and hold and drag it up to a tiny value of 0.08. This just thickens up the waveform so it sounds like this. Now we need to plug in the filter section, and this is going to involve the use of virtual patch cables. At the moment, oscillator's 1 output, which is right at the bottom, is plugged directly into the amplifier section, which we can see says out 1. We need to effectively disable that patch point and put the filter in the way. The way we do this is by clicking and holding on the end of the cable and plugging it back in on itself. This should then eliminate the connection. Using the same output from oscillator 1, we're going to plug it into the input on the filter section, which you can see on the left-hand side. We then need to route an output from the filter back into the output section. We're going to use the filter which is described as LP6, that's low pass 6, which is a 1-pole filter. Create another patch chord by clicking and holding and drag it up to the output section. We now have the filter in place and it will sound like this. We'll come back to the cutoff control in a minute. As part of this patch, we're going to use oscillator 2 playing at a slightly different pitch to oscillator 1. So we need to make a connection from the output of oscillator 2, which again is right at the bottom of the oscillator section, and drag it into the second filter input point. Having made that connection, it now sounds like this. Much the same, to be fair, but you'll hear a difference the moment we start changing the tune pot, which we want to set to a value of +7. At the moment, that's very subtle, so if we move down to the phase distortion pot and set that to a value of 61, we'll hear it more clearly. And because that's now quite loud, we can turn the volume of the output of the oscillator down a little bit. We'll turn it down to a value of 35. Apart from using virtual patch cable connections on the Bazille CM, you can also route things by selecting the legend below pots, as is the case with out 1 here, where it says envelope 1. This means that envelope 1, despite the lack of a patch cable, is going in the direction of the VCA, the amplifier section. It's currently doing some pretty heavy-duty sustaining, so we're going to change the settings of envelope 1 to give us our punchy bass sound. Starting with the attack phase, set that to 0, then set the decay fader to a value of 36, we'll set the sustain fader to a value of 0, and the release fader to a value of 30. When you play now, the notes will be far shorter. Even though envelope 1 is being used for the amplifier section, we can also use the same envelope for modulation of various other aspects of our sound. We're going to use it for a couple of different modulation effects, beginning with the filter. So, moving to the envelope 1 section, take the output from envelope 1 and create a virtual patch cable that goes towards the filter section, and particularly one of the modulation pots. Notice that these modulation pots don't have any kind of characters or legend around them, but you can see that there's an arrow pointing in the direction of the cutoff control. Once you've made the connection, set the pot to a value of 116. This is the modulation amount. We're also going to make some other alterations to some of the controls in the filter section, starting with the gain that we're going to set to a value of 40. This will give us a considerable change and increase in volume. Next, go to the cutoff pot and set that to a value of 0, which is all the way down. And then move to the resonance pot and set that to a value of 49. You'll hear that the envelope is modulating the filter as well as the amplifier. And it's starting to sound a whole lot punchier. To give us even more punch and movement, we're going to use envelope 1 for a second time in a second modulation setting. Create another virtual patch cable by clicking on the output and dragging a cable all the way over to oscillator 2 and the phase distortion modulation pot. Much like the filter settings, we're going to set the modulation amount that we want using the pot that we've connected. Set the phase distortion modulation pot to a value of 60. Now when you play, envelope 1 is modulating both the amplifier section, the filter section, and the phase distortion of oscillator 2, giving us a very serious punch.